The most dangerous form of power is not the tyrant. It is the administrator who calmly says, "This is for your own good." In the modern world, freedom is rarely destroyed by villains. It is usually destroyed by managers, not by dictators screaming into microphones, but by experts, committees, and planners explaining that the situation is too complex to be left to ordinary people. Because power today does not always seize control through sudden coups or theatrical brutality, more often it professionalizes. It becomes procedural, institutional. It arrives wearing the language of responsibility. And this is the hidden connection between three traditions that are almost never placed in the same frame. Friedrich Hayek, America's Cold War wise men like Dean Acheson and George Kennan, and Noam Chomsky's critique of hegemony in Hegemony or Survival. They are not saying the same thing, but they are describing the same transformation. The rise of a world where domination no longer announces itself as conquest, but as management. So tonight I want to explore one central question. How does freedom disappear? Not because people hate it, but because institutions begin treating it as too dangerous to leave unmanaged? Hayek, planning is not destiny. Hayek's argument in The Road to Serfdom is often misunderstood. He is not claiming that every welfare policy leads inevitably to dictatorship. His deeper claim is psychological and structural, that modern societies become vulnerable to coercion when they begin to believe that central direction is necessary. Because freedom is not only risky, it is burdensome. Freedom requires uncertainty. It requires responsibility. It requires admitting that no one is fully in control. But planning offers an escape from that burden. Planning offers the comfort of inevitability. If the experts are managing things, then failure is not personal. If history is moving forward, then resistance feels pointless. And Hayek's warning is that this emotional desire, the desire to be relieved from uncertainty, creates the conditions for authority to expand, not through villains, but through administrators. Coercion does not always arrive as brutality. Often it arrives as coordination, as necessity, as emergency. And once society accepts the premise that complex life must be planned, then the question becomes only, who will plan it? The wise men managing the world. Now something remarkable happens after World War II. The same logic of planning that Hayek fears domestically begins to appear in foreign policy. A new class of American statesmen emerges, the so-called wise men, figures like Dean Acheson, George Kennan, Robert Lovett, John McCloy, men who saw themselves not as conquerors, but as stewards of global order. These were not populists, they were not demagogues, they were strategic professionals, managers of empire. And here is where the connection becomes sharp. They believed that peace was not something that simply happened. It had to be administered. Stability had to be enforced. The world had to be structured. Dean Acheson, for example, often treated international law as secondary to power. For him, order was not the product of universal justice. It was the product of American leadership. And George Kennan, often remembered today as a cautious realist, was still operating within the same framework, that the United States must preserve dominance in strategic regions, that the post-war world could not be left open-ended, that rival centers of power must be contained. Kennan at all times was unusually frank. The United States held a disproportionate share of global wealth. The task of policy was to maintain that advantage, and sentimental talk about human rights, he suggested, was often for public consumption. So what you see in the wise men is not crude imperialism, but managerial imperialism, the belief that global society requires supervision, that sovereignty is conditional, that international life must be organized around a center, in other words, planning abroad. This is where Noam Chomsky enters. In Chapter 2 of Hegemony or Survival, Chomsky argues that modern American grand strategy is built on an unspoken assumption that U.S. global dominance must be maintained indefinitely, that hegemony is not optional. It is treated as the foundation of security. And Chomsky's critique is not simply that the U.S. behaves badly. It is that the entire system of legitimacy becomes asymmetrical. International law is invoked selectively. Humanitarian rhetoric is deployed strategically. Enemies are condemned under standards that allies are exempt from. The word terrorism, Chomsky argues, becomes politically useful precisely because it is not applied neutrally. It becomes what they do, not what we do. And humanitarian intervention becomes a moral vocabulary that masks domination. Chomsky does something important by referencing men like Acheson and Kennan, because they are not irrational fanatics. They are rational managers. And their rationality makes the doctrine more chilling, not less. They represent the professional class that administers hegemony in calm tones. So Chomsky's argument is that the so-called benevolent hegemon is often a myth. Benevolence is the narrative. Dominance is the constant. The road to serfdom abroad. So what emerges when we connect these three strands? Hayek warns that domestic planning erodes liberty, because knowledge is dispersed and coercion follows administration. The wise men export planning outward, treating global order as something to be managed. Chomsky argues that hegemony becomes the silent doctrine beneath the language of law and morality. In all three, power is not always brutal. It is procedural, institutional, professional. It does not always announce itself as tyranny. It announces itself as responsibility. And that is perhaps the central danger of modern politics. Not the villain, but the administrator. Not hatred, but management. Not conquest, but inevitability. The road to serfdom is not only a domestic road. It can become an international system. And the question is not whether the planners have good intentions. The question is whether any society, or any world order, can remain free once it accepts the premise that freedom is too dangerous to leave unmanaged. So when people hear Hayek, they often think the warning is simple. Socialism leads to tyranny. But that's not really what he's doing. Hayek is describing something deeper. A shift in how modern societies begin to think, a world where freedom starts to feel irresponsible, and management starts to feel like maturity. And once you accept that premise, that life is too complex to be left unplanned, then the only question becomes, who will plan it? Who will administer it? Who will decide what counts as security? What counts as stability? What counts as necessity? This is the road Hayek is asking us to notice, not because history is destined to repeat itself, but because the temptation is permanent, the temptation to trade uncertainty for coordination, to trade liberty for reassurance, to trade choice for inevitability. And the real danger, Hayek suggests, is not the villain, it's the administrator, not hatred, but management. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more original, entertaining material. And feel free to hit the like button. I'll see you in the next one.